My name is Margaret Calloway. Everyone who matters to me calls me Maggie. I'm 27 years old, and the night before my Harvard Law School interview, my younger sister Camille poured half a bottle of bleach down the front of my only blazer while looking me dead in the eye. I stood there frozen with the iron still warm in my hand. My mother didn't even glance up from her phone. She said, "Stop making a scene, Margaret. It's just a jacket. You're always so dramatic." My father added, without setting down his wine glass, "Your sister is under a lot of pressure right now. Don't make this about you." I wore the ruined blazer anyway. 6 hours later, I sat across a mahogany desk from the Dean of Admissions at Harvard Law School. He looked at the bleach stain running down the navy wool, then at my last name on his intake sheet, and his face changed in a way I will never forget. He opened the second drawer of his desk, pulled out a folded piece of paper that had been sitting there for 14 months, and said, almost to himself, "Wait, you're her." What my family spent a decade trying to erase was about to become the exact thing that took their whole story apart. If you've ever been the daughter your family quietly decided to make smaller, this one is for you. Like the video if it's hitting close to home. Subscribe if you want to hear how it ends, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand the whole house before you'll understand what happened in that office. I grew up in a 6-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of street where the hedges are trimmed on a schedule and the mailboxes match. My father, Walter Calloway, was a litigation partner at a firm in Midtown Manhattan, the kind of firm with its name carved into the lobby marble. My mother, Diane, sat on the board of the Greenwich Hospital Auxiliary, chaired the Spring Garden Tour Committee, and had a standing Thursday lunch with 3 women whose husbands were also partners at firms with their names carved into marble somewhere. That lunch table, Deborah, Patricia, and a rotating 4th chair depending on whose marriage was going through something that quarter, functioned, as far as I could tell growing up, as the actual governing body of my mother's entire emotional life. Whatever got said at that table on a given Thursday became, by Thursday dinner, the version of events my mother had fully adopted as her own, polished and repeated until it hardened into something she genuinely seemed to believe. I used to think of it, uncharitably, as a kind of parliament that met weekly to approve the official narrative of the Calloway family, with my mother serving as both prime minister and press secretary. From the outside, we looked exactly like the family the local paper photographed every June for the Garden Walk feature. Big house, good schools, 2 daughters in matching Easter dresses on the lawn. I was the older one. Camille came 3 years after me. From the week she was born, my mother talked about her differently. Camille had the easier smile. Camille had the face people lean toward in a room. Camille had, in my mother's words, a natural warmth that I apparently did not possess, though I was 7 years old the first time I heard her say it, and I'm still not sure what I was supposed to do with that information. I remember a debate tournament when I was 12. I'd worked on my closing argument for 6 weeks with our school's forensics coach. I won my division. When my mother picked me up, she said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and then spent the entire ride home on the phone confirming that Camille, who was 9 and had quit gymnastics 8 months earlier, would be the featured child in that year's holiday card photo because she photographed so much better in red. That was the pattern of the house. It didn't announce itself, it just accumulated, the way water stains a ceiling long before anyone notices the leak. When I was 10, I went looking for a pair of tights in the second drawer of my mother's dresser. She caught me with my hand still on the drawer pull. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. That wasn't how she operated. She closed the drawer slowly, the way you'd close a door on a room you didn't want anyone looking into, and said, "Margaret, this drawer is mine. I don't go through your things, and you don't go through mine. That's simply how this house works." I didn't open that drawer again for 17 years. You'll hear about the day I finally did. When I was 16, I said out loud at the dinner table, for the first time, that I wanted to be a lawyer. Not the kind who merges companies, the kind who represents people who can't afford one. I'd been thinking about it for months by then, ever since a school assembly where a public defender had come to speak to our civics class, and I remember rehearsing the sentence in my head for most of dinner before I finally said it out loud, the way you rehearse something you already suspect won't land well. My father set his fork down slowly, the way he did when he was about to correct something in a deposition, and said, "Public interest work doesn't pay enough to matter, Margaret. You'd be working yourself into the ground for people who'll never be able to thank you properly." My mother smiled at me the exact way you smile at a child who has just told you she's going to grow up to be a mermaid, and said, "Well, it's good to have ideals at your age," in a tone that made ideals sound like a phase she expected me to outgrow the way I'd outgrown horses and a brief obsession with marine biology. 2 weeks later, at a fundraiser for the hospital auxiliary, I overheard her tell a friend, "Camille's thinking about human rights law. Isn't that wonderful? She's always had such a heart for people." Camille was 13. She had never once mentioned it to me, and as far as I could tell, she never mentioned it to herself either. Not really. Not until it became useful. A few days after that, my father came and sat on the edge of my bed the way fathers do in the movies, right before they say something they've clearly rehearsed. He'd changed out of his suit but was still wearing the tie, loosened, which meant he'd come straight up after getting home rather than settling in first, which told me he'd been thinking about this conversation the whole drive back from the city. "Margaret," he said, "the law is a long, grinding road. Your sister has the temperament people respond to in a courtroom. You're better suited to something more behind the scenes. That's not a criticism. That's an observation." I asked him, quietly, what exactly about me made him think I didn't have that temperament, since as far as I knew, he'd never once watched me argue anything in front of anyone. He paused at that, longer than I expected, and then said, "You think too much before you speak, Margaret. Juries like certainty." I told him I thought carefully because I cared about getting things right, not because I lacked conviction, and he patted my knee in the specific way that meant the conversation, as far as he was concerned, was over. He believed, genuinely believed, that he was being kind to me. By the time I turned 17, I understood exactly what had already been decided in that house. They had picked which daughter would grow up to be the lawyer. They had simply never bothered to inform me that I wasn't her. There's a version of this story where I tell you about one bad night and let you assume the rest was fine. I don't want to do that, because it wasn't one night. It was hundreds of small nights that all looked almost reasonable on their own. When I was 13, I made the varsity debate team as the only freshman that year. My coach called my mother directly to tell her, which should tell you something about how unusual it was. My mother thanked him politely, hung up the phone, and then spent 40 minutes on hold with a private school admissions office trying to get Camille, who was 10 and had been asked to leave her second travel soccer team that spring for what the coach diplomatically called difficulty with team dynamics, into a specialized enrichment program for gifted, high-empathy children. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway listening to her describe Camille to a stranger on the phone as the kind of child who lights up every room she walks into. while I stood 4 feet away, holding a certificate with my own name on it that nobody in that house had asked to see yet. When I was 14, my mother took a photograph of the two of us for the family Christmas card, the kind that goes out to 200 of her closest acquaintances every December. In the proof she picked, I'm standing half a step behind Camille with my hand on her shoulder, angled so that I'm mostly visible from the side. I asked her, half joking, why I looked like a bodyguard in my own family photo. She looked at the picture again, genuinely considering the question, and said, "You photograph very seriously, Margaret. It works better this way." I don't think she meant it as cruelty. I think, honestly, that's what makes it worse. Cruelty you can identify and defend yourself against. This was something quieter, an entire belief system about which daughter deserved to be looked at directly, delivered so calmly that arguing with it felt insane. I don't want to pretend Camille had it easy in that house either, even though it took me years and, honestly, the events of this past spring, to really let myself see it clearly. I remember a specific afternoon when she was maybe 11, sitting at the kitchen island doing math homework while my mother stood over her shoulder correcting her handwriting on a worksheet that had nothing to do with penmanship, telling her that girls who present well get remembered. A phrase I heard my mother repeat to her at least a dozen times over the years in one form or another. Camille cried in the upstairs bathroom afterward, quietly, the way both of us had learned to cry in that house, behind a locked door, fast, so no one downstairs would hear it and turn it into a scene. I sat outside that door for 20 minutes that day, 12 years old myself, not sure whether to knock because we weren't the kind of sisters who comforted each other. Not really, not by then. My mother hadn't just decided which daughter got the spotlight. She'd also decided, just as firmly, what that spotlight was allowed to cost the daughter standing in it. And I don't think Camille ever got much say in either part. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from growing up in a house where you're never punished for anything, exactly, and never praised for anything either, where you simply become the background against which someone else gets to be the foreground. I used to think, as a teenager, that if I could just accomplish something undeniable enough, something so large my mother couldn't find a way to redirect the light off of it, the pattern would finally break. I made varsity debate. I made the honor roll every single semester of high school. I got into 3 colleges with merit scholarships attached. Each time, my mother found the exact right-sized compliment to hand me. "Nice, sweetheart, that's nice." Before turning the conversation, smooth as water finding a lower point, back toward whatever Camille was doing that week that she'd decided was more interesting. I want to be fair to my father here, because it would be easy to make him sound like a bystander, and he wasn't, not really. He was a much more active participant than bystander would suggest. He simply did his participating in a quieter register than my mother did hers, in observations delivered gently from the edge of my bed, in silences at dinner, when she said something about me that wasn't quite true. In the specific way he'd changed the subject the second I brought up wanting something for myself that wasn't already part of the plan he and my mother had drawn up for the family. A plan that had never, not once, actually included me as anything other than a supporting character. The night I told them, at 16, that I wanted to become a lawyer, a real one, the kind who sits with people rather than the kind who sits across a boardroom table from them, my mother's smile was the thing I keep coming back to, even now. It wasn't mean. That's what made it land the way it did. It was gentle and amused and completely, totally unmoved. The exact expression of someone humoring a child who has just announced an ambition everyone in the room already knows won't happen. I went upstairs after dinner that night and cried in a way I hadn't in years. Not because anyone had yelled at me, but because I finally understood, in a way I couldn't unknow afterward, that no amount of doing everything right was ever going to change the seat I'd been assigned at that table. I applied to Fordham on my own, wrote every essay without showing either of them a single draft, and got in with a partial scholarship. I told them at the kitchen counter. My mother said, "Fordham's fine. It's not a school we'd put on a holiday card, but it's fine." My father said, "Don't expect us to fund law school after this. We're saving for your sister's education, and frankly, hers is the one likely to pay off." I started at Fordham that September. I worked 2 jobs the entire way through, a campus library desk during the week, a hostess shift at a steakhouse on weekends, and I still graduated with just under $30,000 in loans I intend to be paying off well into my 30s. I didn't invite either of my parents to a single family weekend in 4 years. I graduated in May of 2021 with honors in political science and a minor in Spanish I'd fought to add because I already knew, somewhere underneath the debt and the double shifts, what kind of law I actually wanted to practice. I drove up to New Haven 3 weeks after graduation, signed a lease on a studio apartment for $1,400 a month I genuinely could not afford, and started work as a case manager and intake advocate at a nonprofit called the Elm City Immigrant Justice Center. My job was to sit with families navigating a system that was never built to be navigated by the people it was built to process, to translate, to explain, to file, to show up in a courtroom at 7 in the morning so a mother wouldn't have to sit there alone. My starting salary was $52,000 a year. When I told my mother, she asked, "Case manager, is that basically a volunteer thing? Are they actually putting you on payroll for that?" The Elm City office itself was nothing like the marble lobby my father walked into every morning in Manhattan. A converted storefront on a side street near the courthouse, with a waiting room full of mismatched donated chairs, a coffee maker that only worked if you jiggled the carafe a specific way, and a bulletin board covered in flyers for ESL classes, tenant rights workshops, and a weekly food pantry 2 blocks over. Corinne ran the place with a combination of fierce warmth and total organizational precision that I came to understand, over time, was the only way to survive doing this work for over 2 decades without burning all the way through. My desk was the third one from the window, wedged between a fax machine nobody had gotten around to replacing and a filing cabinet whose bottom drawer stuck if you didn't lift while pulling. I loved that desk more than I ever expected to love a piece of furniture. Most days started around 8, with a stack of intake files, and ended somewhere well past 6, because the families who needed us most rarely had schedules that fit neatly inside business hours. A mother getting off a hotel housekeeping shift at 5, a father who could only meet before his overnight warehouse job started. I learned, within my first month, that the job was never really about the paperwork, even though the paperwork was constant and unforgiving. It was about sitting across from someone in the worst chapter of their life and making sure they never once felt like a case number instead of a person. Corinne used to say the whole job could be summed up in one sentence: never let anyone leave this building more confused than they walked in. I tried to live by that, and mostly, I think I did. That was the office I walked into 2 months in when a woman named Rosa Cordero and her 8-year-old daughter walked into our intake office on a Tuesday afternoon in August. That was the day I met Valentina. Meanwhile, 3 years behind me, Camille had entered Georgetown that same September of 2021. My mother managed her sister's path the way she managed a seating chart, with total control and total conviction that she alone knew how the room should look. There was a private LSAT tutor billed at $400 an hour. There was an admissions consultant in Manhattan who specialized, according to her website, in narrative strategy for competitive applicants. There were shadowing placements arranged through donor connections at 2 different nonprofits, including eventually my own. There were immigration law casebooks bought in advance and arranged on Camille's shelves like furniture, spines uncracked. My mother told her Thursday lunch table that Camille had been volunteering at the Elm City Immigrant Justice Center for over a year and had just the most natural gift with these families. I pulled the visitor sign-in log later. In 3 years, Camille had signed in exactly 4 times. Total cumulative time on site, 5 hours and 40 minutes. By then, I had logged over 3,000 hours. Only one of us would eventually be told that those numbers mattered, and it would not be my mother who told her. I want to tell you about Valentina before I tell you anything else, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense once you understand who she was to me, not what she became in a hearing room years later. A distinction I've had to keep making, out loud, to myself, more than once since all of this ended. Because it would be easy, in hindsight, to let the legal fight overwrite the actual child at the center of it. And I refuse to let that happen, even here, even now, telling you this. Her full name was Valentina Reyes Cordero. She was 8 years old when she and her mother Rosa crossed into Texas in the spring of 2021 and made their way, over the following months, to a cousin's apartment in New Haven. Rosa was 36. She had worked as a seamstress in a garment shop outside Guatemala City until the shop's owner, and then the neighborhood itself, became too dangerous to stay in. Valentina's father, Hector, had been killed 3 years earlier, shot outside a bus stop in a targeted extortion killing that had nothing to do with him personally, and everything to do with the gang that controlled that stretch of road. Rosa had been raising Valentina alone since she was 5. Rosa told me, months into knowing her, that Hector had been a mechanic, the kind of man who fixed neighbors' cars for free when they couldn't pay and let them settle up whenever they could, if ever. She still had a photograph of him on her phone, taken at Valentina's 4th birthday, grease still under his fingernails from a job he'd rushed home from, holding his daughter up on his shoulders so she could reach the piñata. Valentina had almost no real memories of him by the time I met her, just the story her mother kept alive on her behalf, told in careful, repeated pieces so the shape of her father wouldn't fade entirely before she was old enough to hold on to it herself. I think part of why Valentina latched onto me the way she did was that I was, in some unspoken way, the first adult in her daily life since he died who wasn't also grieving him at the same time she was. Someone new, without that particular weight already attached, who could just show up and be present without also needing comforting herself. The first day I sat with them in our intake room, Rosa was crying quietly into a folded paper napkin, and Valentina was sitting very straight in the plastic chair beside her, with her hands folded in her lap like she was in church. Rosa's English was serviceable for grocery stores and bus schedules, but the immigration officer who had processed their initial paperwork had used words like credible fear interview and notice to appear at a speed that left her with nothing but the shape of her own fear. Valentina thought, from the little she'd overheard, that they were going to be sent somewhere and separated. I sat down across from them and switched into Spanish, and I watched something in Rosa's shoulders come down an inch. I explained what a credible fear interview actually was, what a notice to appear actually meant, that no one in that building was trying to take Valentina away from her mother that day. I told Valentina, in Spanish, that she was safe in that room right then, and that whatever happened next, I was going to walk through it with them, every step, together. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and took my hand and held it. The way you'd hold something you'd already decided you weren't going to let go of. I didn't know it yet, but she'd made a decision about me that afternoon, the same way I'd unknowingly made one about her. I came back the next day to check on their paperwork, and then the day after that. And within a month, I was spending 4 to 6 hours a week with that family, well outside my official caseload. Because Rosa's asylum petition needed constant tending, and because, if I'm honest, I wanted an excuse to see Valentina's face when she figured out a new English word. I taught her to say objection like a courtroom lawyer, which she found endlessly funny, standing up on the couch in their apartment with one small hand raised, shouting it at her stuffed rabbit. She loved a beat-up library copy of a book about a fox and a prince that lived in her backpack, and some afternoons, I'd read her a chapter after her homework was done, and she'd stop me every few pages to ask a question that had nothing to do with the plot, and everything to do with what she was actually thinking about. One afternoon, halfway through a chapter, she looked up and said, "Maggie, do you think someone will write something nice about me someday?" I told her, of course they will. I had no idea at the time that I was hearing her say the plan out loud before either of us understood it was one. I should tell you what those first 6 months actually looked like, before the diagnosis, before any of it turned into something a hearing room would one day pick apart sentence by sentence. Because that part mattered too, maybe more than any of what came after. Rosa's asylum case moved the way most asylum cases move, which is to say slowly, with long stretches of waiting, broken up by sudden bursts of paperwork that had to be filed within impossible windows. I helped her gather country conditions evidence about the extortion economy that had killed Hector, tracked down a police report that had nearly been lost in a records office outside Guatemala City, and sat with her through 2 separate intake interviews where an asylum officer asked her to describe, in granular and clinical detail, the worst day of her life, twice, in a language that wasn't hers, while a stranger typed notes on a government laptop. Valentina came to most of those appointments because there was no one else to watch her. She'd sit in the waiting room with a coloring book, and every so often I'd catch her watching her mother through the little window in the interview room door, her face doing that specific kind of stillness kids do when they're trying very hard not to let anyone see how scared they are. I started keeping a small stash of things in my desk drawer just for her. Pretzels, a deck of Uno cards missing the green 4, a set of markers I'd bought myself because the office ones had all dried out. She named the stuffed rabbit I mentioned earlier, Judge Peluche, which, when I finally understood the pun she'd built entirely on her own out of a Spanish word for plush and a courtroom title she'd picked up from hanging around our office, made me laugh so hard Corinne came out of her office to see what had happened. Valentina held court with that rabbit for the better part of a year, presiding over invented trials involving her mother's missing hairbrush and, on one memorable Tuesday, me, whom she found guilty of too much serious face, and sentenced to read her 3 extra pages of her book about the fox and the prince as restitution. I taught her to say objection first as a joke, and then, without quite meaning to, I started teaching her other things too. How to shake a stranger's hand and look them in the eye. How to explain what a notice to appear was in her own words, so she'd never again have to sit in a waiting room not understanding what was happening to her family. How to ask a question out loud, even when she was scared of the answer. Because I told her the asking mattered just as much as whatever came back. I didn't know, watching her practice all of that in our cramped little intake office, with its bad fluorescent lighting and its wall of donated children's books, that I was teaching a 9-year-old the exact skill set she'd eventually cite, word for word, as the reason she wanted someone like me to have a career like this one. I just knew that some kids make you want to be better at your job than you actually are yet, and she was one of them, from the very first afternoon. Rosa, for her part, brought me things too, in the quiet, insistent way people who have very little sometimes give anyway, because giving is its own kind of dignity. A container of tamales left on my desk on a Friday, a pressed flower from the community garden she'd started tending behind their apartment building. Once, on the 1-year anniversary of the day we met, a small hand-embroidered handkerchief with my initial stitched crookedly into one corner, because Rosa had done piecework as a seamstress for 15 years back home and hadn't lost the habit of making something with her hands for people she'd decided to love. I still have that handkerchief. It's in the drawer of my nightstand, not hidden, just kept. In February of 2022, 6 months after we met, Rosa called our office in a panic because Valentina had a fever that wouldn't break and bruises that wouldn't fade. I met them at Yale New Haven Children's Hospital that same afternoon, mostly to translate, thinking it would be a 2-hour visit. It became the hinge of the next 2.5 years of both our lives. The blood work came back that evening. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Valentina was 8 years old, and she was undocumented, and her asylum case was still pending, and now she needed chemotherapy that would run, best case, for at least 2 years. This is the part people don't always understand about immigration work. The legal case and the human being are never actually separate, no matter how the paperwork tries to pretend they are. A pending asylum case doesn't stop a hospital from treating a sick child in Connecticut, but it complicates everything around the edges. Insurance categorization, school enrollments, the constant low hum of fear that any interaction with any government office could somehow unravel the fragile status they were standing on. I filed for a medical deferred action alongside the ongoing asylum petition. I sat through more hearings and more hospital consultations in the same week than I can count. I learned the language of oncology the way I'd learned the language of immigration court, by sitting in rooms and refusing to let anyone leave a family behind on the vocabulary. Valentina's oncologist was Dr. Anita Farrow, who had been treating pediatric leukemia at that hospital for 19 years, and who, more than once, waited an extra 15 minutes so I could get there in time to translate the hard parts for Rosa myself, rather than through the hospital's phone interpreter line, because she said Rosa listened differently when it was a face she trusted saying the words. My supervisor at Elm City was a woman named Corinne Okafor, a senior case manager who had been doing this work for over 20 years and who watched me disappear into that one family's file for 2.5 years without ever once telling me to pull back, only ever asking if I was sleeping. Valentina's primary infusion nurse, a woman named Deb Halloran, who'd been on that floor for over a decade, wrote in the hospital's family coordination notes, on at least 30 separate occasions that I later found in the chart, some version of the same sentence. Family stability significantly supported by Advocate M. Calloway's continued presence. Valentina's hospital room had a window that faced the parking garage, which she decided, with the stubborn optimism only a very sick 8-year-old can manage, was actually the best window on the floor because you could watch the sun rise directly over the top of it every morning without anything blocking the view. There was a stretch in the spring of 2023 when she couldn't keep food down for 2 straight days, and on the third morning, gray and thin against the pillows, she watched the light come up over that ugly parking garage and turned to me and said, "The sun came up again, Maggie. I made it. I'm still here." I wrote that down that same week in a note on my phone. The kind of note you tell yourself you're keeping just so you don't forget it, not because you think you'll ever need it for anything official. I remember one hearing in particular, in the fall of 2023, when Valentina was already a year into treatment and Rosa's asylum case finally got its merits hearing date at the immigration court in Hartford. Valentina had begged to come, even though she'd had chemo 3 days earlier and still had a bandage taped over the port in her chest, because she said she wanted to watch Mommy win. I picked both of them up at 6 in the morning so we'd have buffer time. Valentina wrapped in a blanket in the back seat of my car, with a beanie pulled down over hair that had mostly grown back thin and soft after the first round of treatment. She fell asleep twice on the drive and woke up each time asking whether we'd missed it. The hearing itself ran nearly 4 hours. I sat behind Rosa at counsel table as her accredited representative, which our organization was able to provide in lieu of a private attorney neither of us could have afforded, and I translated in a low voice throughout anything that moved too fast for her, while Valentina sat 2 rows back between Corinne and a stack of coloring books, mostly quiet, occasionally craning her neck to see her mother's face when the judge asked something particularly hard. The government attorney pushed on inconsistencies between Rosa's initial border interview and her later testimony, the kind of small, human inconsistencies that show up in almost every traumatized person's account of the worst day of their life. And I watched Rosa's hands shake under the table while she answered every question anyway, steady-voiced, because she had one daughter sitting behind her who needed her to still be in this country when the treatment plan called for another 18 months of infusions she couldn't get anywhere else. The judge granted asylum from the bench that same afternoon, a rarity I hadn't seen happen more than a handful of times in 3 years of practice. Valentina, when we told her what it meant in words she could understand, threw both arms around her mother's neck and then, almost as an afterthought, threw one arm around mine too, pulling me into the hug without asking, the way kids do when they've decided you belong somewhere and don't feel any particular need to explain why. We stopped at a diner in Hartford afterward, and Valentina ordered chocolate chip pancakes, even though her stomach could barely handle bland food most days that month. And nobody in that booth said a word about it. Because some days, you let a 9-year-old have the pancakes. I want to be precise about something because it matters later. I never once, in 2.5 years, treated Valentina's case like a story I was collecting for myself. I loved that kid the way you love a person, not the way you love a good anecdote. What happened to that love afterward? The way it got picked up, repackaged, and handed to someone who had never sat in that hospital room is a different kind of theft than the kind most people picture when they hear the word. I had never planned to apply to law school in the 2024 cycle. I'd told Corinne early that year that I intended to stay with Valentina's family through whatever came next, however long that took, before I let myself think about my own next step. Corinne had said, "That's a hard choice to make. It's also exactly the choice that tells you what kind of lawyer you're going to be. Just make sure you can find your way back to yourself when it's over." I drafted a personal statement anyway that April, mostly because I was afraid that if I didn't get the sentences down while I was living inside them, I'd lose the shape of what I actually wanted to say once enough time had passed to dull it. I wrote it on a Tuesday evening after work. I wrote about Valentina by name. I wrote about Rosa, about Hector, about the bus stop in Guatemala City. I wrote about teaching an 8-year-old to shout "objection" at a stuffed rabbit, and about the parking garage window, and about the morning she told me the sun had come up again. I saved the file, out of habit, to the shared family Google Drive my mother had set up back in 2016 as a place for report cards and vacation itineraries, a habit I'd never bothered to break even after I moved out, because it was simply where important documents in my life had always lived. I closed the laptop at a little past 6 that evening and didn't think about the file again. What I didn't know was that 12 nights later, at 2:14 in the morning, my mother opened that file. I didn't know that 9 minutes after she opened it, she texted my father about it. I didn't know that less than a month after that, My sister Camille would submit her own application to Harvard Law School for the 2024 cycle, with sentences of mine sitting inside her essay like they'd always belonged to her. In June of 2023, Valentina relapsed. She was 9 by then. The news came during what should have been a routine follow-up appointment, a blood panel that came back wrong in a way Dr. Farrow's face told us about a full 10 seconds before she said a single word. Rosa's legs actually gave out a little when I translated it for her. I remember catching her elbow and easing her into a chair in the hallway outside the lab, both of us sitting there for a minute before either of us could go back into the room where Valentina was waiting. We spent the rest of that summer chasing a bone marrow transplant. Rosa was tested first, then a cousin back in Guatemala who agreed to fly up for testing on our organization's dime, then a registry search that turned up 2 potential matches, both of which came back over the following months, close, but not close enough for a transplant team willing to take the risk. I sat with Rosa through every single one of those phone calls delivering the news, and I watched her go from devastated to numb to something that looked almost like practiced calm by the third one. The specific, terrible calm of someone who has learned that falling apart doesn't actually change the outcome. It just uses up energy she needed for the next round of bad news. Valentina handled the relapse itself with a kind of matter-of-fact toughness that undid me more than tears would have. "I already know how to do this part," she told me the first week back on the infusion floor, meaning the chemo schedule, the nausea medication rotation, the specific way to breathe through a bone marrow aspiration if you focused hard enough on a spot on the ceiling. She'd graduated, somewhere in that first round of treatment, from a kid who was scared of the hospital into something closer to a veteran of it. And there was a particular kind of grief in watching a 9-year-old become an expert in her own dying, one procedure at a time. By the fall of 2024, she had grown thin in the way that stops being about weight and starts being about something else entirely. In September, Dr. Farrow told Rosa, with me translating every word as gently as I knew how, that they had run out of options that would do more good than harm. Hospice began that same week. Dr. Farrow was the one who delivered that news. She would also, a few weeks later, be the one Rosa handed a folded letter to. Corinne had watched me sit at that family's bedside for 2.5 years by then, and she never once suggested I hand the file to someone else, not even in the final weeks, because she understood, the way people who've done this work a long time understand, that some cases are not files at all. In October, with Valentina very weak but still entirely herself, still sharp-eyed and stubborn, she asked her mother to write something down for her. Rosa sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment and wrote, in pencil, in her own handwriting, exactly the words her daughter said out loud. It was 1 page. It would end up mattering more than any document my family had produced in 3 generations. A week later, on the morning of October 17th, 2024, Rosa handed that folded page to Dr. Farrow during morning rounds and asked her, in Spanish, to please give it to someone who could help Margaret become a lawyer. The next evening, October 18th, the Elm City Immigrant Justice Center held its annual Volunteer and Donor Appreciation Dinner, the kind of event where the families we served and the people who funded our work sat at the same round tables and pretended, for one night, that the gap between those 2 groups wasn't as wide as it actually was. Rosa attended, invited as a guest speaker for the families panel. So did my mother, who sat on the advisory board of one of the family foundations that funded roughly a quarter of our budget. The 2 of them had never met. Rosa recognized my mother from a photograph I'd once shown her on my phone of the 4 of us at a Christmas years earlier, back before I'd stopped bringing my phone out around Valentina's bed at all. Rosa walked up to her after the program ended and introduced herself. "I have something for Maggie," she said, and handed my mother a folded piece of paper, a drawing Valentina had made with a stub of colored pencil on the back of a hospital worksheet. On the reverse, in shaky, determined handwriting, were 5 words. My mother told her she would deliver it that same night. She did not deliver it. I would not see that drawing for 14 months. The day after the dinner, Dr. Farrow forwarded Valentina's letter to a former colleague of hers, a man she'd trained alongside at a legal aid clinic years before either of them had settled into their current careers. A man named Julian Voss, who had gone on to teach immigration and family law and had, since 2022, served as Dean of Admissions at Harvard Law School. Dr. Farrow's note to him was one line: "For when this applicant arrives." Dean Voss read the letter, folded it back along its original creases, and put it in the second drawer of his desk. Valentina died in early November of 2024. I went to her funeral. So did Rosa, obviously, and Corinne, and Deb from the infusion floor. My parents did not come. My sister did not come. 3 weeks later, Rosa showed up at my apartment in New Haven, carrying a navy wool blazer in a garment bag. She told me it had been hers, from a job interview years before she'd ever left Guatemala, that she hadn't worn it since Hector died, and that she wanted me to have it for whatever came next. "Para tus entrevistas," she said. "Mija, Valentina would want you to walk in wearing something with strength already sewn into it." I had no way of knowing, standing in my doorway holding that garment bag, that Valentina had already started writing the next chapter of my life before I'd even understood there was one coming. Camille was admitted in March of 2025. She matriculated that August. By the time February of 2026 came around, she'd completed her first 2 semesters as a 1L at the exact school I was about to interview at myself. I didn't apply to anything in the immediate aftermath of losing her. I want to be honest about that stretch, because it wasn't dignified or cinematic. It was just quiet and slow, and mostly involved me going to work, coming home, and sitting on my apartment floor most evenings, not doing much of anything at all. Corinne gave me 2 weeks of paid leave I hadn't asked for, and told me, when I tried to argue with her about it, "You don't get to skip grieving just because you're good at your job, Maggie. Take the 2 weeks." I spent most of that time driving out to Bridgeport to sit with Rosa, the 2 of us doing very little together besides existing in the same room, sometimes with the television on, and neither of us watching it. By January of 2025, I'd gone back to something resembling a normal caseload, though Corinne quietly kept the most emotionally brutal cases off my desk for a few months, without ever explicitly saying that's what she was doing. I started studying for the LSAT that spring, mostly at my kitchen table at night with a secondhand prep book I'd bought used off a college student's dorm clean-out post, because I genuinely could not stomach the idea of a $400 an hour tutor after everything I'd learned about how my sister's version of that process had gone. I took the exam in June, scored well enough to make the schools I actually wanted a realistic conversation rather than a fantasy, and started drafting my real personal statement, not the one still sitting untouched on the family Google Drive, but a new one, written fresh, on my own laptop, saved nowhere near anyone else's login. It took me most of that summer to figure out how to write about Valentina in a way that didn't feel like I was using her, because that fear, that I might become exactly the thing my sister had already become without meaning to interrogate it, sat with me through every single draft. I finally landed on something close to the truth. I didn't write about her to make myself sound good. I wrote about her because 2.5 years of sitting with that family had taught me more about what kind of lawyer I actually wanted to be than 4 years of undergraduate seminars ever had. And pretending otherwise in a personal statement would have been its own kind of dishonesty. I showed the final draft to exactly one person before I submitted it, and it wasn't anyone in my family. It was Rosa, sitting at her kitchen table in Bridgeport on a Sunday afternoon in September, reading it slowly in English while I sat across from her holding my breath. When she finished, she folded the pages back along their creases, the same careful way she'd once folded a drawing for me, and said only, "Es verdad. Todo esto es verdad." It's true. All of this is true. That was the only approval I needed before I hit submit. I submitted my own application in the fall of 2025, later than I'd originally planned, because Valentina's case, and then eventually Valentina herself, had taken up nearly every hour I had outside my job for 2 straight years, and I would not have changed a single one of those hours, even knowing what I know now. I received my interview invitation in January of 2026. The interview was set for Monday, February 16th, in Cambridge. My mother called me the Thursday before that, her voice bright in the specific way it got when she wanted something from me. "Come home Saturday night," she said. "Your father's doing the osso buco. We want a family dinner before your big day." I hadn't been back to Greenwich in nearly a year. I said yes anyway because some small, stubborn part of me still believed that a family dinner before something that important had to mean something, even after everything. I drove up from New Haven on the afternoon of Saturday, February 14th. I hung the blazer in the closet of my old bedroom, which my mother had since converted, somewhat pointedly, into a home yoga studio with my childhood bed pushed against the wall to make room for a mat. My father met me at the door and said, "Margaret, good of you to make the drive. Camille's home for the weekend too, from Cambridge," in the tone of a man announcing a merger. Dinner was cold, in the way dinners can be cold, without a single raised voice. My mother asked Camille detailed questions about her torts professor, about a moot court competition she'd apparently done well in, about whether the second-year students had been friendly to the first years at the fall mixer. She asked me exactly one question the entire meal, whether I'd remembered to bring a nice enough outfit for Monday, and moved on before I'd finished answering it. My father spent most of the meal talking about a case his firm had just settled, a securities dispute involving numbers large enough that he clearly expected the size of them to be impressive on its own without any further context. At one point, he turned to me and said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man offering genuine career advice, "You know, Margaret, even if this Harvard thing doesn't pan out, there's real, stable work in compliance, something with actual structure to it. Might be worth keeping in your back pocket." I said I'd think about it, mostly because I'd learned a long time ago that disagreeing with him at that table rarely shortened the conversation. When I mentioned my interview directly, my mother set down her fork with the small, precise motion she used whenever she was about to say something she considered both honest and generous. "Yes, we'll see how that goes," she said. "Harvard isn't exactly a sure thing for everyone," in a tone that made it very clear she did not consider it a sure thing for me specifically, and possibly considered it something closer to an amusing long shot. Camille had been quiet through most of this, pushing risotto around her plate without eating much of it. She set her fork down at that point and looked directly at me for the first time all evening, something tight and unreadable in her face. "You know I'm already there," she said. "You know what that means, right?" I didn't answer her. I genuinely didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. Not the way I would 48 hours later. Looking back, I think that was the closest she came all night to trying to warn me, in the only language our family had ever really taught either of us. Sideways, half said, and too late to actually stop anything. After dessert, I went upstairs and brought the blazer down to the laundry room to steam it before Monday morning. The laundry room opened off the kitchen with a clear line of sight into the family room where everyone was still parked on the couches with their coffee. I laid the blazer flat across the ironing board, plugged the iron in, and turned my back for maybe 10 seconds to fill the water reservoir at the sink. When I turned around, Camille was standing in the doorway holding a gallon jug of bleach with the cap already off. She walked to the ironing board, lifted the jug, and poured it straight down the front of the blazer. And she did not stop pouring until the jug was nearly empty. The wool drank it in instantly. The bleach hissed faintly against the still warm surface of the iron. An orange-yellow stain bloomed out across the navy fabric, 18 inches long, spreading while I watched. She looked up at me and smiled. My mother, from the couch, did not lift her eyes from her phone. "Stop making a scene, Margaret. It's just a jacket. You're always so dramatic." My father, half a glass of Cabernet into the evening, said, "Your sister's under a lot of pressure right now. Don't make this about you." I stood there with the iron still hot in my hand for longer than I can account for. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything, though I want you to know I thought about it, clearly and specifically, for about 4 full seconds. I had spent years, if I'm honest, quietly imagining what I'd finally do the day my family crossed a line I couldn't step back from. I'd rehearsed every kind of scene in my head, the yelling, the walking out, the dramatic exit lit by a slammed door. What I hadn't imagined was that when the actual line finally got crossed, I would simply switch the iron off, fold the ruined blazer over my arm, and walk upstairs in total silence. Camille went back to the couch. My mother didn't look up. My father topped off her wine. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, now half a yoga studio, for the better part of an hour with the blazer across my lap. The stain was already setting into something permanent by the time I stopped looking at it. I didn't try to rinse it out. I'd handled enough hospital laundry over the years, watching aides deal with far worse on far more important fabric, to know exactly what bleach does to wool once it's had time to sit. At some point during that hour on the edge of my old bed, I texted my best friend Priya Nair, who I'd met my first week at Fordham, and who had spent the better part of a decade being the only person in my life who consistently believed me about what my family was actually like, because she'd witnessed enough of it firsthand over the years to never once need convincing. I sent her a photo of the blazer. She called me within 90 seconds, and I picked up and just sat there for a second, not sure what I even wanted to say. "Okay," she said, in the calm, no-nonsense voice she used whenever I called her from inside some new version of the same old disaster. "Tell me exactly what happened, slowly, and then tell me what you need right now, because those might be 2 different conversations." I told her. She was quiet for a moment when I finished, and then she said, "Maggie, I need you to hear me say this clearly, because I know you, and I know you're already halfway to explaining this away in your head. Your sister destroyed the one professional garment you own the night before the biggest interview of your life, in front of both your parents, and your mother called you dramatic for standing there in shock. That's not a family being stressed. That's a family that has decided for years now that your feelings are an inconvenience to be managed. You already know that. You've known it since you were about 11. I just don't want you gaslighting yourself out of it tonight of all nights." I didn't say much back. I didn't have much left to say. But I slept those 4 hours a little easier than I would have otherwise, knowing someone outside that house had heard the whole thing and hadn't tried to talk me into being smaller about it. And then, somewhere in that hour, I noticed something underneath the anger that surprised me more than the bleach had. Camille hadn't done that because she was cruel. She'd done it because she was afraid of something. I didn't know yet what. I slept maybe 4 hours. At 5:15 on Monday morning, I came down the stairs in the ruined blazer. The house was still dark. Nobody was awake to see me go. I didn't leave a note. I drove 90 miles to Cambridge in near total silence, the radio off the whole way. Just the sound of tires on I-95 and then I-84 and then the Mass Pike. Watching the sky go from black to that particular flat gray it turns right before sunrise. And then, somewhere around the Hartford exits, the actual color coming up over my left shoulder in the mirror. Orange bleeding into the gray, the same way the bleach had bled into the navy wool 2 nights earlier. Though I didn't let myself notice that particular parallel until much later, driving home that same evening with a different kind of weight in the car. I stopped once, outside Sturbridge, for gas and a coffee I didn't really want, mostly because I needed 5 minutes standing outside the car in the cold to remind my body that it was still capable of feeling something other than numb. I checked my reflection in the gas station window before I got back in. Bleach stain visible even under the fluorescent overhang lighting. Hair pulled back the way I'd practiced in the mirror a dozen times over the past 2 years for exactly this kind of high-stakes morning. Face doing its best impression of composed. I told myself, out loud, in an empty parking lot at 6:40 in the morning, that whatever happened in that building today, I had already survived worse rooms than an admissions office. Then I got back in the car and finished the drive. I walked into Griswold Hall a little before 9 with a bleach stain across my chest and absolutely no idea that the man interviewing me at 11:15 had been waiting 14 months to meet me. I checked in with the admissions coordinator at the front desk. There were 9 applicants interviewing that day, each of us scheduled for 3 separate sessions, 10 o'clock, 11:15, and 1:30. My first interview was with Professor Naomi Whitcomb, Associate Dean of Student Affairs. My second was with Dean Julian Voss himself, Dean of Admissions. My third was with a Mr. Desmond Kerr, Director of Admissions Operations. The coordinator glanced at her screen and added, almost as an afterthought, "Your 11:15 is with Dean Voss directly. He requested that slot specifically. That happens occasionally." I noted it. I didn't understand it yet. Professor Whitcomb interviewed me first, warm in the professional, practiced way admissions staff learn to be warm. Her office was smaller than I expected, with a wall of framed photos from what looked like a decade of graduation ceremonies. Students in caps and gowns with their arms around her in the way you only see with professors who actually meant something to the people they taught. She asked about my clinical and casework experience, and I told her about Elm City, about bilingual advocacy, about sitting with families through hearings most lawyers never bother to attend in person because the billable hours don't justify the drive. She asked what drew me to immigration work specifically, rather than some other area of public interest law, and I gave her an honest answer instead of a rehearsed one. That I'd grown up in a house where being useful to someone else was the only reliable way to earn a place at the table, and that somewhere along the way, I'd decided I'd rather choose who I made myself useful to, rather than have it decided for me. She made a small, surprised sound when I mentioned the hour count. "That's not typical," she said, flipping back through my file. "Most candidates come in under 1,000 hours total, and most of that's shadowing, not direct advocacy." She asked 2 more questions about specific cases, careful not to press for identifying details, and I gave both answers slowly, choosing each word the way you choose a step across ice. Because even then, before I fully understood what was waiting for me at 11:15, some instinct in me already knew this wasn't a morning to be careless with the truth. She didn't say anything about the bleach on my blazer, though I caught her glance at it twice. I'd decided in the car that I wouldn't bring it up unless someone else did first. I walked out of her office at 10:50 with 25 minutes to kill. I spent most of them in a bathroom on the second floor, standing in front of the mirror, looking at the stain and rehearsing what I'd say if Dean Voss asked. I decided I'd tell him the truth, the whole thing, not a softened version I could deliver more comfortably. At 11:15, I knocked on his door. His office was wood-paneled, with framed photographs of what looked like legal aid clinics on the walls, a shelf of case reporters, one closed folder centered on an otherwise empty desk, and one laptop open beside it. He stood, shook my hand, and motioned me toward the chair across from him. He looked to be somewhere in his early 60s, gray at the temples, with the kind of unhurried calm that comes from decades of not needing to prove anything to anyone in a room. He was quiet for a beat longer than felt normal. I realized he was looking at the stain on my blazer. He cleared his throat and said, "Miss Calloway, tell me about a client who changed the way you think about the law." I'd prepared 3 different polished answers for that exact question on the drive up. I used none of them. I told him about Valentina. I gave him her full name. I told him about the leukemia, about Rosa, about Guatemala City and the bus stop, and Hector. I told him about teaching a 9-year-old to shout objection at a stuffed rabbit, about the parking garage window she insisted was the best one on the floor, about the morning she told me the sun had come up again after 2 days of not being able to keep food down. I told him about the relapse, the hospice, the last weeks. I spoke for close to 7 minutes. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he didn't ask a follow-up question. He didn't thank me for sharing. He simply stood, walked to the second drawer on the left side of his desk, opened it, and took out a thin folder. From inside it, he removed one folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk between us and left it face down. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I want to be sure I'm understanding what I think I just heard. Valentina Reyes Cordero, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, diagnosed February of 2022, treated at Yale New Haven Children's, mother Rosa, father deceased. A parking garage window. A book about a fox and a prince. You're that Maggie?" I said yes. He sat back down slowly, looked at the bleach on my blazer, looked at something on his laptop screen, and looked back at me. "I have been waiting 14 months to meet you," he said. Then, quieter, almost to himself, "Wait, you're her." He turned the paper around and slid it across the desk. I recognized the handwriting before I'd even finished reading the first line. The slope of the letters, the particular way certain accents sat over certain vowels. It was the same hand that had written me 100 appointment reminders and grocery lists over the years. It was Valentina's voice, carried in her mother's handwriting. Dean Voss read it aloud, slowly, without any performance in it. "To whoever decides who gets to be a lawyer, please pick Maggie. She held my mom's hand when the words got too fast for her. She said everything in Spanish so we could understand. She taught me to say objection and made me laugh on the worst days. She's already a real lawyer, the kind that matters. Please. Valentina Reyes Cordero, age 9. He set the letter down and folded his hands. "This came to me through Dr. Anita Farrow at Yale New Haven on October 18th of 2024. She and I trained together at a legal clinic years ago. Her note to me was one line, for when this applicant arrives. I didn't know when you would arrive. I didn't know, frankly, whether Valentina had survived. I learned that part just now, from you. This letter has been sitting in that drawer for 14 months. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, Miss Calloway, there's a second piece of information in your file that I'm not in a position to show you in this room. It came to us through a third party, but I can tell you this much. Someone else in your family used elements of Valentina's story in their own application essay to the school last year. I noticed the overlap the moment your statement arrived this fall. I've been waiting to sit across from you in person to understand which version of that story was actually true. I went very still. I didn't say anything. He stood again. You have one more interview at 1:30. Please attend it as scheduled. This doesn't change anything about how the rest of today goes for you. After today, I'll be in touch. There's a formal process for what happens next, and I want to walk you through it properly, not in a rush, and not in this room. He held the door for me on my way out. I walked out of Griswold Hall at 12:06 with 80-some minutes before my next interview and no idea what to do with my hands. I sat on a bench under a bare oak in the courtyard and made myself think, clearly and in order, about who in my family had access to that Google Drive folder. I already knew the answer before I finished the thought, but I made myself walk through it anyway, methodically, the same way I'd learned to walk a client through a timeline of evidence rather than trusting my own first, angriest read of a situation. I called Priya from that bench because I needed one voice that wasn't mine or Dean Voss's rattling around in my head before I went back in for a third interview I now had to somehow perform normally through. She picked up on the first ring. She'd been waiting to hear how the morning went. I told her everything, fast and a little breathless, and she went quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was genuinely stunned rather than just processing. Maggie, she finally said, you understand this isn't a coincidence anymore, right? This isn't your mom being thoughtless with a shared drive. Someone read your unpublished, unfinished grief, decided it was usable, and handed it to your sister like a costume. I need you to actually let yourself be as angry about that as it deserves, at some point today, even if today isn't the day you have room for it yet. I told her I didn't have room for it yet. She said that was fine, that she'd hold some of the anger for me in the meantime if I needed her to, and that I should go back in and finish my interviews like the extraordinarily composed person she'd watched hold entire falling-apart families together for 3 straight years. Because apparently, I was capable of doing that for strangers all the time, and it was about time I extended myself the same professional grace. I sat with that for a second, thanked her, and went back inside for my 1:30 with Desmond Kerr, who I answered on some kind of practiced autopilot I still don't fully remember executing, though he apparently thought well enough of the conversation to note, in an email a week later, that my answers on housing court advocacy had been some of the most grounded he'd heard from an applicant that cycle. Which still makes me laugh a little, thinking about the state I was actually in behind that composure. I drove back to New Haven that evening slower than I'd driven up. I called Corinne from the road first. She picked up on the second ring. Corinne, I need to ask you something. Did you ever know that Camille, my sister, claimed to have shadowed at Elm City? There was a pause. She never set foot on our floor for more than an hour and a half at a stretch, Maggie. 4 visits in 3 years. I keep the sign-in log myself, every single volunteer who comes through that door. Why are you asking me this right now? I told her I'd call her back. There was one more call I had to make first. I dialed my mother. She picked up bright and performative, the exact register she used when she wanted an audience for her own kindness. Margaret, sweetheart, how did it go? I didn't answer that question. Mom, I said. Did Camille write about a client named Valentina Reyes Cordero in her Harvard application essay? The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a genuinely long time on a phone call. My mother's surprise came in too late and left too fast. "Margaret," she said, "what on earth are you talking about?" I hadn't said Valentina's last name. I hadn't described who she was. My mother hadn't asked. My mother said, "You sound exhausted. Come home tonight, we'll sort this out." I told her no, that I was going back to my own apartment and that I'd call her when I was ready. I hung up. My mother had recognized a name I'd never once said to her. That told me everything I needed to know before I'd gathered a single piece of paper. At 9:15 that night, an email arrived from Dean Voss, sent to my verified applicant address. "Miss Calloway, thank you for your candor today. I'd like to schedule a follow-up conversation. I'm prepared to walk you through the formal options available to you, including a complaint to the Harvard Law School Committee on Academic Integrity and Professional Conduct, which handles matters like this within the school. I'll also need a written statement from you regarding your professional relationship with Valentina Reyes Cordero and her family, should you be willing to provide one, and I intend to contact Dr. Anita Farrow directly to confirm the chain of custody on the letter. Please propose a time within the next 10 days. Attached was a one-page outline of the committee's process, complaint filed and reviewed within 2 weeks, investigation over 4 to 6 weeks, formal hearing, decision. I scheduled the follow-up for March 3rd, which gave me roughly 2 weeks to find every document my mother had ever touched, and 2 weeks to sit with the fact that I'd have to walk back into that same office once more before any of this became official. I drove back up to Cambridge on the morning of March 3rd. His office looked exactly as it had 2 weeks earlier, except this time there was a second folder on his desk beside the thin one from our first meeting, and he'd set out 2 cups of coffee before I arrived, which struck me as an unexpectedly human gesture from a man I'd only ever seen in full institutional mode. He walked me through the process in more detail than the one-page summary had: how a complaint got formally logged, who on the committee would review it, what standard of proof they'd apply, what rights Camille would have to respond at each stage. He was careful throughout not to editorialize, not to tell me what he thought the outcome should be, though at one point, closing the folder, he said, "I want to be honest with you about something, Miss Calloway, since I think you've earned that much candor. In 22 years doing this work, I have never once had a piece of evidence like that letter land on my desk before an applicant arrived. I don't know what to do with the coincidence of it, except to take it seriously, and to make sure whatever happens next happens correctly, not quickly." I asked him whether he thought Camille would be expelled. He told me, plainly, that wasn't a question he was in a position to answer before the process had even begun, and that speculating with me about it wouldn't serve either of us. I respected that answer more than I expected to. Back home that evening, I sat on my apartment floor with my laptop and a legal pad and opened the family Google Drive. I found my personal statement draft from April of 2024, clicked into the version history, and watched the timeline of the document unfold. 23 edits between March and May of that year, every single one of them mine. And then one access entry that didn't match the pattern at all. May 14th, 2024, 2:14 a.m. Account: Diane Calloway. No edits, just viewed. I wrote a list on the legal pad. Sign-in log: Corinne will pull it. Google Drive version history: already have it. Camille's submitted essay: committee can subpoena it. My father's texts: only if he's willing to hand them over. The drawing: where is the drawing? There was one piece of this Dean Voss had told me the committee couldn't show me directly. A piece written, or at least handled, by my own mother. I was going to have to find that myself. I want to pause here and say something about what those 6 weeks between the interview and the hearing actually felt like from the inside. Because it wasn't the clean, righteous momentum a story like this can sometimes sound like once you've compressed it down to its main beats. Some nights I sat on my apartment floor with the evidence spread out in front of me and felt entirely certain I was doing the right thing. Other nights, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd catch myself wondering whether I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone building a legal case against her own sister with the same cold precision I used for asylum petitions. Someone who'd learned to weaponize the very skills Valentina had once found so funny when I shouted them at a stuffed rabbit for her amusement. I called Priya more than once during those weeks, just to ask her, half joking and half not, whether I still sounded like myself. She always said yes, and I believed her more some nights than others. I kept working my full caseload the entire time, because families in the middle of their own crises don't pause for mine. And there was something almost stabilizing about walking into the office each morning and sitting with someone else's fear for a few hours. A reminder that the world was bigger than the specific injustice currently consuming my evenings. Corinne noticed I was running thinner than usual and didn't say much about it directly, just started leaving a granola bar on my desk most mornings without comment. The same quiet, practical kindness she extended to every client who walked through our door, too proud to ask for help outright. The formal complaint process opened on March 4th. I sent a written request asking the committee to compare my submitted personal statement from the 2025 cycle against Camille's submitted statement from the 2024 cycle, specifically flagging the paragraphs describing a pediatric leukemia patient. And I attached my original 2024 draft with the Google Drive timestamps proving authorship. Dean Voss replied within 18 hours. The request had been received, the committee had authority to run the comparison under the school's academic honesty policy, and the process would formally begin the following Monday. I had set something in motion I could no longer quietly take back. I didn't want to take it back. Dean Voss followed through on his promise to contact Dr. Farrow directly. She called me the following week to let me know their conversation had gone well, in her clipped, efficient way of delivering good news like it was just another lab result. I confirmed the chain of custody for him, she told me. Told him exactly how the letter came to me, exactly when I forwarded it, exactly what I wrote in that note. I also told him, since he asked, what kind of advocate you were for that family, because I figured it couldn't hurt for that to be on the record from someone with no stake in either sister. I thanked her. She said, "Don't thank me. I watched you show up in that hospital for 2.5 years without once making it about yourself. This is the least I can do to make sure the truth of that gets where it needs to go." That call meant more to me than I let on to her at the time. That same week, Corinne sent me 3 files. She'd pulled the records herself through the internal volunteer coordination policy, the kind of access that only comes from 24 years of being trusted by an institution. The first file was my own advocacy log, 3,200 hours across my full caseload, 1,180 of them logged specifically with Valentina and Rosa, hospital visits, court appearances, translation sessions, the after-hours time I'd always logged out of pure professional habit. The second file was Camille's visitor sign-in record, 4 total entries across 3 years, cumulative time on site, 5 hours and 40 minutes. Visit 1, April of 2022, before Valentina had even been diagnosed. Visit 2, brief, never near Valentina's file. Visits 3 and 4, equally brief. Camille had never once met Valentina Reyes Cordero. The third file was a stack of Deb Halloran's coordination notes, 31 separate entries referencing my presence with the family. Corinne attached one line to the package. Maggie, I've done this work for 24 years. This is one of the cleanest contrasts I have ever pulled from our own records. Use it carefully. Use it once. I want to back up here and tell you what those 3 years actually looked like from where I was standing, because the sign-in log only tells you the outcome, not the machinery that produced it. It's a strange thing, seeing a relationship reduced to a spreadsheet, 4 rows, a handful of timestamps, the entire architecture of a lie fitting neatly into a table that would have taken up less space on a page than this single paragraph. I remember staring at that log the first time Corinne showed it to me and thinking that grief and fraud, it turns out, can both be measured the exact same way. In hours, logged honestly or not, by people who either showed up or didn't. My mother had a particular gift, one I'll begrudgingly admit was genuinely impressive in its own way, for constructing a resume the way other people construct a house. Foundation first, then load-bearing walls, then whatever decorative trim would photograph well. Camille's LSAT tutor, a former big law associate turned full-time test prep consultant who charged $400 an hour and did all his sessions over video from what looked like a home office in Greenwich itself, met with her twice a week for the better part of a year. The admissions consultant in Manhattan, whose entire business model, as far as I could tell from the one time I looked her up out of morbid curiosity, was teaching wealthy, mediocre applicants how to sound like they'd suffered meaningfully, billed my parents in retainer blocks of $5,000 at a time. My mother once mentioned, at a dinner I was unfortunate enough to be present for, that the consultant had told her Camille's file was a little thin on lived experience, and that they were actively looking for the right kind of story to build the personal statement around. I remember excusing myself to the bathroom after that sentence and standing at the sink for a full minute before I could make myself go back to the table. The shadowing placements were arranged, as far as I was ever able to piece together, through 2 different donor relationships, one at a legal clinic in Stamford where my mother sat on the advisory board, and one, eventually, at my own organization, after my mother made a call to Elm City's executive director that I only learned about years later, framed as a generous offer to have Camille get some real hands-on exposure to the immigration bar. Corinne, to her credit, ran every single volunteer through the same intake and training process, regardless of who their mother had called, which is precisely why the sign-in sheet exists at all, and precisely why it eventually told the truth so cleanly. At Christmas in 2022, I watched my mother tell her entire Thursday lunch table, gathered that year at our house for an early holiday gathering, that Camille had been practically living at the Immigrant Justice Center, learning Spanish informally just by being around it, and developing what she called a real fluency for these families' pain. Camille, sitting 3 feet away from me at that table, did not correct a single word of it. She smiled and let it land and reached for more wine. I remember looking at her across the table and feeling something that wasn't quite anger yet, something closer to a kind of sad, distant recognition, the way you might watch someone walk toward a cliff edge they can't see because someone they trust told them the ground kept going. I tried, once, to talk to Camille directly about it in the spring of 2023, on one of the rare weekends both of us happened to be home at the same time. We were doing dishes together after dinner, an activity neither of us had volunteered for so much as been assigned to by our mother, and I asked her, as gently as I knew how, whether she actually wanted to go to law school, or whether she just hadn't figured out yet how to want something different out loud in that house. She went very quiet for a moment, drying the same plate longer than it needed, and said, it's easier to just be who they already decided I am. I didn't understand at the time how much that one sentence explained about everything that came afterward. I understand it much better now. It doesn't excuse what she did, but I think it's the closest thing to a real answer she ever gave me, and I think some part of her meant it as an apology she didn't yet have the courage to make directly. 5 hours and 40 minutes. That was the entire relationship my sister had ever actually had with the child she'd spent 5,000 words describing as though she'd watched her grow up. 2 days after those files arrived by email, I drove to the Elm City office in person anyway, mostly because some part of me needed to see the actual paper before I could fully believe what I already knew was coming. Corinne met me at the door with a manila folder already sitting on her desk, as if she'd known I'd show up before I knew it myself. We sat together at my old third desk while she walked me through the sign-in log, page by page, her finger tracing down each column of dates and times in her own neat handwriting, decades of institutional habit that had never once needed a computer to be reliable. "I want you to look at this and really see it," she told me. "Not just hear the number. 4 visits. Look how short they are. Look how none of them overlap with anything on Valentina's active treatment calendar." I sat there and looked at the actual ink on the actual page until the abstraction of 5 hours and 40 minutes turned into something I could see with my own eyes and never unsee again. 4 short lines of a signature that wasn't mine, dated across 3 years, next to hundreds of pages bearing my own handwriting stretching back nearly as far. The entire imbalance of my family laid out in something as unglamorous and undeniable as a sign-in sheet. Before I left that afternoon, Corinne pulled one more thing out of her desk drawer: a printed volunteer orientation packet every person who came through Elm City's doors was required to sign, including, apparently, Camille, back in April of 2022. Page 3 of that packet, initialed in my sister's own handwriting, stated plainly that any volunteer referencing client stories in personal, academic, or professional materials outside the organization was required to obtain written client consent first under the center's confidentiality policy. "She signed this," Corinne said quietly, sliding it across the desk. Whatever she tells that committee about not understanding what she was doing, she signed this page herself 4 visits in before she ever came anywhere near Valentina's file. I photographed that page too and added it to the folder. In early March, Dean Voss called me directly. The call lasted 9 minutes. His tone was the same measured procedural register he'd used in his office. "Ms. Calloway, the committee has completed its comparative review of the 2 essays. The overlap is substantial. Specifically, the phrase, 'She watched the sunrise every morning, even on the days she couldn't eat,' appears verbatim in your sister's submitted essay. In our professional judgment, the probability of 2 siblings independently writing that same sentence about the same child is effectively 0. The committee will need one further piece of evidence before we can escalate to a formal hearing. Is there anything physical in your family's possession connected to Valentina Reyes Cordero?" I knew the answer to that question. I just didn't know yet where to find it. I called Rosa that night. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 4 months, not since the holidays. She picked up, cautious, the way she always did with a number she didn't recognize, until she heard my voice. "Rosa," I said, "I need to ask you something. Did you ever meet my mother in person?" The silence on the line went on a long time. "See, Maggie," she finally said. The October before Valentina passed. There was a donor dinner at the center. Your mother was there. I knew her name because you'd mentioned her once. I went up to her and told her I had something for you. She said she'd deliver it to you that same evening. I gave her the drawing Valentina made. For you. I asked her to describe it. Pencil on the back of a worksheet from the hospital's school program. A drawing of a woman with dark hair sitting at a table with a little girl, both of them looking at each other. On the back, in Valentina's own shaky handwriting, 5 words. For when you become a lawyer. Valentina, age 9. I told Rosa I'd never received it. There was a longer silence this time, and then she started crying quietly into the phone. Mijo, I thought you had it this whole time. All this time, I thought you had it. I stayed on that call for almost an hour. I told her everything, the committee, Camille's essay, the letter sitting in Dean Voss's drawer for 14 months. She listened without a single interruption. At the end, she asked simply, "What do you need me to do?" I told her I'd call her back. There was one thing I had to do first, on my own. On the evening of March 30th, my father called me. He hadn't called me directly in over a year. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered it. "Margaret," he said, "I need to see you. Not your mother, not your sister, just me. There are things I should have said years ago, and there are things on my phone you need to see." We met at a coffee shop in New Haven the following afternoon. He looked like he'd lost weight I hadn't noticed over video calls. He set his phone on the table between us and didn't look at me while he did it. "I let her do this," he said. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to know." He unlocked his phone, opened a text thread with my mother, and scrolled back to May 14th, 2024. He turned the screen around and let me read it myself. 2:31 a.m. Diane. Just read Margaret's draft. The Valentina section is the strongest writing anyone in this family has ever produced. Camille has nothing close to it. Should I send it to Camille? 6:14 a.m. Walter. Diane. That's Margaret's work. 6:16 a.m. Diane. Margaret isn't applying this cycle, Walter. She's staying with that family through the end of it. Camille applies June 1st. This is just giving her material to work from. Margaret will write something else next year. She always does. 6:21 a.m. Walter. No response logged. 6:22 a.m. Diane. We only get one real shot at getting one of these two into a school like that. Camille's LSAT alone won't carry her. This is what parenting looks like sometimes. There were 50-some more messages in that thread over the following 10 months, most of them logistics, which clinical detail Camille should reference in a given supplemental essay, when to schedule her admissions consultant calls, one exchange specifically about the possibility that I might apply the following year and what, if anything, they should do about that. My father airdropped the entire thread to my phone on the spot. 52 messages, plus a 2-minute voice memo he'd recorded himself, alone in his car, the night before. He handed me that, too. I should have said no, he told me. Not saying no is the same thing as saying yes. I know that now. I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. I left that coffee shop with everything I needed. 2 days after that coffee shop meeting, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Preston Wexler, introducing himself as counsel retained by my parents on behalf of the family. He was polite in the specific, careful way lawyers are polite when they're trying to figure out how much you actually know before they show any of their own cards. He asked whether I'd consider a private resolution, his words, before the committee process went any further. He mentioned, almost in passing, that a formal dismissal from law school could follow Camille for the rest of her professional life, that these things have a way of escalating past what anyone originally intended, and that perhaps a quieter conversation between the two sisters, facilitated by counsel, might serve everyone's interests better than a recorded hearing. I let him finish. Then I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, whether he was aware that the letter at the center of this entire matter had been written by a 9-year-old who was no longer alive to advocate for herself, and whether he'd reviewed the Google Drive metadata his own clients had access to before agreeing to represent them in this particular fight. There was a pause on the line that told me he hadn't fully understood what he'd been asked to defend when he took the retainer. He said he'd be in touch, thanked me for my time, and I never heard a substantive settlement offer from him again. I found out much later, from my father, that Wexler had quietly recommended to my parents, in writing, that they consider whether contesting the hearing at all was actually in Camille's best interest. They ignored that advice completely, the same way they'd ignored most advice that didn't already agree with the plan they'd built years earlier. That weekend, on April 4th, my mother called and asked me to come home Sunday, saying, "Your father needs you here. This has gotten out of hand." I went. I did not go for her. She opened the front door with her arms already crossed. "Margaret, we can fix this. Drop the complaint. We can make this whole thing go away. Camille doesn't deserve to lose her entire future over one sentence." I asked if I could use the upstairs bathroom. I walked past her before she could answer, up the stairs, past my old room, and straight into the master bedroom. I opened the second drawer of her dresser from the top. The same drawer she had told me 17 years earlier was hers alone, that she never went through my things and I was never to go through hers. Underneath a folded stack of silk scarves, exactly where she'd once implied her private things lived, was a folded piece of hospital worksheet paper. I unfolded it. Pencil. A woman with dark hair sitting beside a little girl, both of them looking at each other instead of at the artist. On the back, in shaky, determined pencil, "For when you become a lawyer. Valentina, age 9. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, looking at that drawer, thinking about the 10-year-old version of me who'd once been told this exact drawer was a place her mother's private things lived, a boundary I'd respected without question for 17 years, even as every other boundary I'd ever tried to draw around myself in that house got walked through without so much as a knock. There was something almost unbearably fitting about the fact that the one thing my mother had kept genuinely private in that entire house, the one drawer she'd guarded fiercely enough to teach a child about it, turned out to be the exact place she'd hidden the evidence of what she'd stolen from me. I photographed it exactly where it lay in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I put the original in the inside pocket of my coat and went back downstairs. The whole family was gathered in the dining room by then. Camille had been notified by the committee on Friday that a formal investigation was underway. Her face was tear-streaked in a way that looked practiced rather than raw. My father was staring at his plate. My mother was staring at me. I laid the drawing face up on the table. This was handed to Mom on October 18th, 2024, by Rosa Cordero at the Elm City Donor Dinner. It was meant for me. Mom kept it in her dresser drawer, second from the top, under her scarves. The little girl who drew this was 9 years old. She died 3 weeks later. Her name was Valentina. Camille opened her mouth. Margaret, you don't understand what it's been like. I cut her off, still without raising my voice. Camille, I have your essay. I have my original draft. I have the sign-in log. I have Mom's texts to Dad. I have the drawing. I'm not asking you to understand anything right now. I'm telling you what's going to happen on Wednesday. My mother reached for the drawing. I put my hand flat over it. She pulled back. You have no idea what you're doing, she said. I picked the drawing up and held it where she could still see it. Valentina did, I said. She knew before any of us. I walked out of that house and I did not look back at the door. That night, I called Rosa and asked if she'd be willing to testify at the committee hearing on April 8th, over video. She was quiet for a long 12 seconds. Sí, mija, she said finally. I will speak for her. I told her she didn't have to, that I had enough evidence without it. She wrote that letter so somebody would listen to her, Rosa said. I'm the only one who heard her voice that day. I'll speak. Then she added, Wear the blazer, Maggie, the bleach and everything. Wear all of it. A few days before the hearing, I drove out to Bridgeport to sit with Rosa and walk through what testifying over video would actually involve, because I didn't want her walking into something that formal without knowing what to expect. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she'd later sew the letter into my blazer, and I explained, in Spanish, what a fact-finding hearing was, who would be in the room, what kinds of questions Dean Voss might ask her, and that she wouldn't be cross-examined the way a courtroom witness would be, because this wasn't that kind of proceeding. She listened carefully, nodding at the right places, and then she said something that stayed with me the rest of that week. Maggie, I've spent 4 years translating my own grief into English for people who needed it filed in triplicate. This will not be the hardest form I've ever filled out. She smiled when she said it, a tired, wry smile I'd seen on her face at some of the worst appointments of Valentina's treatment. The specific expression of someone who has found a way to keep her sense of humor intact through things that should have taken it from her permanently. I asked her, gently, whether she was sure she wanted to do this, whether some part of her might rather leave the whole thing alone and just grieve privately, without a committee, without my sister's face on a screen in front of her. She reached across the table and took my hand, the same way Valentina had that very first day in room 4B, all those years earlier. Mija, she said. My daughter used the last strength she had left to write a letter so that somebody would finally listen to her. I am not going to let that letter sit quietly in a drawer for the rest of my life just because listening is uncomfortable for other people. I will speak. I want to speak. That settled it. And we spent the rest of the afternoon simply eating and not talking about the hearing at all, because she said she'd rather save what was left of her nerves. On the evening of April 7th, the night before the hearing, Camille called me. Her voice was cracked, but still, underneath it, oddly rehearsed. Margaret, please, I'll lose everything. I'll lose Harvard. I'll lose my whole future. I'm 24 years old. I made one mistake. Camille, I said, you didn't make a mistake. You wrote 5,000 words about a child you spent under 6 hours with in your entire life. You wrote about watching her die from a paragraph our mother handed you at a kitchen counter. That's not a mistake. That's a decision you made, over and over, for 10 months. You don't know what it was like, she said, her voice cracking further. Getting into a school like that, knowing everyone assumed it was because of Mom's connections anyway. I needed something that made it look earned. I needed a story that made it look like I'd actually done the work. I let that sit for a second before I answered, because there was something almost pitiable in it, some genuine small kernel of truth buried inside a justification that still didn't excuse anything. "Camille," I said, "the work was earning it, honestly, even if it took longer, even if it meant a worse LSAT score or a smaller acceptance letter. You skipped the only part of this that would have actually been yours." "You don't have to do this tomorrow," she said. "Yes," I said, "I do." She hung up. I saved the call log. At 11:18 that night, my mother left me a voicemail, 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. Her voice on it was different than I'd ever heard it. Not performing for once, not smooth. Something closer to genuine panic underneath the familiar script. "Margaret, listen to me. If you do this tomorrow, your sister will be dismissed from law school. She will never become a lawyer." Is that really what Valentina would have wanted? Valentina would have wanted both of you to succeed. Valentina would have wanted healing, not this. You are the one tearing this family apart, not her. Drop the complaint. It's not too late. Your father agrees with me. We can still fix this. I listened to it twice, sitting on my kitchen floor with my knees pulled up to my chest. And somewhere around the second listen, I noticed something I hadn't caught the first time. She called her Valentine instead of Valentina. Twice. A small, careless slip that told me everything about how much real attention she'd ever actually paid to the child whose memory she was now invoking to get what she wanted. At 11:23, my father texted me separately, 3 lines. "Your mother doesn't speak for me. Do what's right. I love you." Priya came over that night and sat with me while I laid every single piece of evidence out across my living room floor one more time, checking it against itself the way you'd check stitches before trusting them to hold weight. She didn't say much. Mostly, she just handed me tea at the right moments and reorganized my takeout containers into the recycling without being asked. The specific, wordless kind of support that doesn't need narrating to matter. Around midnight, sitting on the floor across from me, she said, "You know tomorrow isn't really about winning, right? I mean, I hope you win. I think you will. But even if that committee somehow got it wrong, you'd still have done the one thing your family never let you do your whole life, which is tell the truth in a room and not shrink it down to fit anyone else's comfort. That part's already true, regardless of what happens tomorrow." I didn't sleep much that night either, but I slept differently than I had after the bleach. Less like someone bracing for another blow, more like someone getting the last few hours of quiet before a long, necessary day of work. I didn't play my mother's voicemail for anyone the next day. I never needed to. I'd already saved the only voice in that entire mess that had actually mattered from the beginning. Before I went to bed that night, I drove out to a small cemetery on the edge of Bridgeport where Valentina was buried. A plot Rosa had chosen because it had a maple tree close enough to shade the headstone in summer. I hadn't planned the visit. I just found myself pointing my car there instead of home, the way you sometimes end up somewhere your body decided on before your brain caught up. It was nearly 11 at night, and the cemetery gates were technically closed, but the fence along the back edge had a gap wide enough to slip through, and I wasn't about to let a padlock stop me that particular night. I sat on the grass beside the small granite marker for a long time, without saying anything out loud, which felt right, because most of what I would have said, Valentina already knew better than I did. Rosa had chosen the epitaph herself, 4 words under the dates. She made it here. I ran my fingers along the carved letters and thought about a parking garage window, and a stuffed rabbit named Judge Peluche, and a 9-year-old dictating a letter to her mother because some part of her, even that sick, even that tired, understood that some fights have to be fought after you're gone, by the people who loved you enough to still be standing. "I'm going to do this right tomorrow," I told her, out loud, to an empty cemetery at 11 at night, feeling only slightly ridiculous about it. Not for revenge, for the record. I think you'd want the record straight more than you'd want anyone punished. I'm going to try to do both, anyway. The wind moved through the maple tree above the headstone, which is not a sign, I know that. I'm not a person who believes in signs. But I sat there another 20 minutes anyway, before I made myself get up and drive home. I woke at 4:45 on the morning of April 8th and put on the bleached blazer. The stain had faded slightly from the steaming I'd given it weeks earlier, but it was still visible across the front from clear across a room. I packed my evidence into a single folder and drove 90 miles to Cambridge. I texted Rosa from the parking lot at 8:52. "Almost time. Valentina's here too." She wrote back within a minute, "Sí, vamos." At 8:58, I walked into conference room 3B in Griswold Hall. Camille was already seated at the table with our family's attorney, a man named Preston Wexler, whom my parents had apparently retained the week before. The committee was assembling on the opposite side of the room. My parents were sitting in the hallway. They weren't permitted inside. The hearing was about to begin. The room held 6 people total. On the committee's side, Dean Julian Voss, chairing, Professor Naomi Whitcomb, and Desmond Kerr, Director of Admissions Operations. On the other side of the table, Camille, with Wexler seated slightly behind her as an advisor only. A camera on a tripod in the corner was recording the proceedings. Corinne sat against the back wall as a professional reference for me. A laptop on a side table was connected to a secure video line. Rosa would join at 11:30. The room itself was smaller than I'd expected for something that would end up carrying so much weight. A windowless conference room with fluorescent lighting and a long table that could have seated 10, most of the chairs empty. The kind of institutional space that could just as easily have hosted a budget meeting as a hearing that would end my sister's legal career before it started. I remember noticing, absurdly, that someone had left a half-empty box of tissues on the credenza against the wall, as if the room itself had learned, over years of hosting hearings like this one, exactly what kind of morning it was about to become for someone sitting at that table. Dean Voss opened the hearing. "This is a fact-finding hearing under the Harvard Law School Committee on Academic Integrity and Professional Conduct, convened to address allegations of academic misrepresentation in admissions materials. Ms. Camille Calloway is the subject of this proceeding. Ms. Margaret Calloway is the complainant. Counsel, Mr. Wexler is present in an advisory capacity only and may not address the committee directly. This hearing is being recorded per committee protocol. Ms. Calloway," he nodded toward me, "the floor is yours." I set my folder on the table and opened it. I started with the numbers, because numbers don't carry any emotion of their own. Advocacy log. 3,200 total hours across my caseload. 1,180 of those hours specifically with Valentina Reyes Cordero and her mother across 27 months. My signature is on every entry. Elm City Immigrant Justice Center visitor log. Camille Calloway, 4 total visits, 5 hours and 40 minutes cumulative time on site across 3 years. None of those 4 visits occurred within 30 feet of Valentina Reyes Cordero's case file. My sister never met this child. Professor Whitcomb was writing steadily. Kerr looked over at Camille, who kept her eyes down on the table. Wexler tried to interject. Dean Voss held up one hand without looking at him. Counselor, this is not a courtroom. This is an academic integrity hearing. Please continue, Miss Calloway. I never raised my voice once through any of it. I never needed to. I laid 2 documents side by side on the table. My original draft from April 2024, with the Google Drive timestamp printed in the corner, and Camille's submitted Harvard essay from June 2024, provided to the committee under subpoena. I'd underlined the same sentence in red on both pages. My draft, dated April 14th, 2024, she watched the sunrise every morning, even on the days she couldn't eat. Camille's submission, dated June 9th, 2024, the identical sentence, word for word. Professor Whitcomb, who had been quiet through most of the numbers, spoke for the first time since the hearing opened. Miss Calloway, she said, addressing Camille directly, your essay describes accompanying this patient to what you called the hardest appointment of her young life in March of 2023. Can you describe that appointment for the committee in your own words without referring to your written submission? Camille opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked at Wexler, who could offer her nothing from where he sat. I don't remember the specific details right now, she finally said. It's been a while since I wrote it. Take your time, Professor Whitcomb said, not unkindly, but not letting the silence close either. What was the appointment for? What did the patient say to you that day? Camille didn't answer. 20 seconds passed, then 30. Professor Whitcomb let all of it sit on the record before she finally said, "Thank you, that's all I needed," and made a note on her legal pad. It was, I think, the single most damning moment of the entire hearing, more than any document I'd brought with me, because it wasn't me accusing my sister of anything. It was my sister discovering, in real time, in front of 3 strangers with the authority to end her career, that she had never actually possessed the memory she'd spent 5,000 words describing as her own. Kerr asked, and the patient in question, did Miss Camille Calloway ever actually provide care or advocacy for this client? She visited our office building 4 times, I said. She never once met Valentina Reyes Cordero. Camille's hand rose to cover her own mouth. At 11:30, Rose's video connected, the audio clear despite the distance. Dean Voss asked her to confirm the origin of Valentina's letter. She did, describing the day she'd written it down at her kitchen table, describing handing it to Dr. Farrow during rounds the following week. Dean Voss then read the letter aloud, slowly, the same unhurried way he'd read it to me in his office 2 months earlier. To whoever decides who gets to be a lawyer, please pick Maggie. She held my mom's hand when the words got too fast for her. She said everything in Spanish so we could understand. She taught me to say objection and made me laugh on the worst days. She's already a real lawyer, the kind that matters. Please. Valentina Reyes Cordero, age 9. He set the original letter face up on the table. The room stayed silent for a long 12 seconds. I counted them. Camille was crying now, not performing, actually crying. Dean Voss asked Rosa if she wanted to add anything. She paused, then spoke slowly, mostly in English with one phrase slipping back into Spanish at the end. My daughter Valentina loved Maggie. She never knew who Camille was. She never met her, not once. Not until October 18th, 2024, when I went to a dinner and gave a drawing to Camille's mother for Maggie. She told me she would deliver it. She didn't. My daughter died believing Maggie had that drawing. Maggie didn't receive it until 5 days ago. I'm here today because my daughter wrote a letter so that somebody would finally listen. Estoy aquí para que alguien la escuche. She disconnected the call at 11:48. I placed the drawing from my folder on the table last. The patient made this on October 16th, 2024. She gave it to her mother the following day. Her mother handed it to my mother on October 18th at the Elm City donor dinner. My mother did not deliver it. I found it 5 days ago in her dresser drawer, second from the top, underneath a stack of folded scarves. I have photographic documentation of exactly where it was. Before he moved on, Dean Voss asked whether the committee could also review the admissions consulting invoices, which he'd subpoenaed the week prior once my written complaint referenced a narrative strategy consultant by name. Kerr slid a printed packet across the table. 6 months of billed sessions, each one logged with a brief description. One line, dated in the spring of 2024, read, "Session focus. Identifying an authentic clinical anecdote for personal statement. Clients currently lack sufficiently distinctive material." 2 invoices later, dated less than 3 weeks after my mother's 2:14 a.m. login to the family drive, a new entry appeared. Session focus. Refining pediatric oncology narrative for maximum emotional resonance. Client report story sourced from family members' professional experience. The room went very still when Kerr read that last line aloud. Even Wexler, sitting behind Camille, looked down at his own legal pad rather than at anyone else in the room. Dean Voss let the silence hold for a moment before he continued. "For the record," he said, "the consultant's own file appears to independently corroborate that the material in question originated with a family member, not with the applicant. The committee will note that as well." Dean Voss picked the drawing up, examined it, and passed it to Professor Whitcomb. She passed it to Kerr. Kerr nodded once. Dean Voss turned to Camille. "Miss Calloway, did your mother give you this drawing, or any knowledge that it existed?" Camille, choking on the words, said, I don't know. I never saw it. I never knew it existed." Dean Voss said, "The committee will request a separate fact-finding interview with Diane Calloway as a witness." He called a 10-minute recess. I walked into the hallway. My parents were sitting on a bench against the wall. My mother stood up the moment she saw Camille's tear-streaked face come through the door behind me. She rushed toward us. "What happened? What did they show in there?" Camille couldn't speak. Wexler tried to steer her into a side conference room to compose herself. My father stood up. He took one step toward my mother. "Diane," he said, "they have the drawing." My mother froze. "You told me you forgot," my father said. "You told me for 14 months that you forgot. Don't." That single word landed in a Harvard hallway, in front of 3 strangers, in front of Wexler, in front of me. 31 years of marriage, and it was the first time I had ever heard my father say one flat, unadorned word to my mother like that. She stopped trying to follow Camille. My father turned to me as he passed on his way back to the bench. Quietly, he said, "I'm sorry. I should have done this years ago." Then, almost as an afterthought, not quite meeting my eyes, he added, "I read your real personal statement this morning, before we drove up. The one you actually submitted. I don't know why I never asked to read anything you'd written before now. 30 years of reading other people's arguments for a living, and I never once sat down and read my own daughter's." He didn't wait for a response, and I didn't have one ready anyway. I went back into the room. The committee was ready to reconvene. When we sat back down, Camille tried one final reframing. "I was going through a hard time. My mother encouraged me to use it. I should have said no. I know that, but I was 21 when I applied. Dean Voss let her finish completely before responding. Miss Calloway, he said, you were 21 when you submitted this application. You are 24 now. You have completed 2 full semesters of law school. At no point in that time did you contact this committee, the Cordero family, or Elm City's staff to correct the record. The committee will weigh that fact heavily. Camille had no answer to that. Wexler leaned in and whispered something to her. She shook her head. Dean Voss turned to me. Ms. Calloway, would you like to make a closing statement? I said yes. I did not attack anyone. I did not raise my voice a single time in that entire hearing. I'm not here to destroy my sister, I said. I'm not here to humiliate my parents. I'm here because a 9-year-old wrote a letter so that I would eventually be heard. I've been heard now. The committee will do whatever the committee decides to do with that. I'd like to enter one final thing into the record. Valentina Reyes Cordero was a person. She had a name. She had a window she insisted was the best one on the whole floor. She had a mother who loved her more than anything else in this world. She had 2.5 years of treatment, and 1 nurse, and 1 oncologist, and 1 advocate who saw her all the way through it. She did not have my sister. She did not have my parents. She had us, and we are still here. That's what this hearing has always actually been about. I sat down. I sat down. I thought for just a second, sitting back in that chair after the room went quiet, about a 9-year-old standing on a couch shouting a single word at a stuffed rabbit, delighted with herself for learning it, having no idea that word would one day be the entire architecture of the career it had helped inspire. I never once said objection in that hearing room. I didn't need to. Every document I'd laid on that table had already made the argument for me. Dean Voss closed his folder. He looked across the table at my sister and said, "The committee will be in touch." Camille finally stopped pretending, right there, in front of everyone. The room went so quiet I could hear my mother breathing in the hallway through the closed door. I drove back to New Haven that evening. I didn't cry. I had no tears left over for that particular day. I made tea, sat on my living room floor with my back against the couch, and sent Rosa one line. "Thank you for speaking for her." She wrote back, "Valentina, siempre." Monday morning, I told Corinne what had happened at the hearing, in the same flat, procedural way I'd learned to deliver hard news to families over the past 3.5 years, because I think some part of me needed to hear it said out loud in a voice that wasn't shaking. She came around her desk and hugged me, which she had never once done in 3.5 years of working together, and said, "You did that the right way, Maggie. Slow and true, and without needing to be cruel about it. That's harder than the alternative, and you did it anyway." Deb Halloran texted me that same afternoon, having heard through Dr. Farrow. "Proud of you, kid. V would be too." I sat in my car in the office parking lot and let myself cry for the first time in weeks. Not out of grief exactly, more out of the particular relief of finally putting something heavy down. After carrying it for so long, you forget your arms are tired. I called Deb back later that week, mostly just to hear her voice, and she told me something I hadn't known. That Valentina used to ask her, on the hard infusion days, whether Deb thought I'd actually become a real lawyer someday, and that Deb always told her yes, obviously, because what else do you tell a 9-year-old who's already decided the answer for you? She wasn't asking because she doubted it, Deb said. She was asking because she liked hearing it confirmed. Kids do that. They like having their own certainty handed back to them by someone else. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. How much of what I'd eventually accomplish had already been decided, quietly and firmly, by an 8-year-old in a hospital bed, long before any admissions committee ever got a say in the matter. I want to say something here about my mother. Not to excuse what she did, because I don't think it can be excused, but because I've had months now to sit with the question of how a person becomes the kind of parent who does what she did. And I think the honest answer is less satisfying than a villain origin story. My mother grew up the younger of 2 daughters herself, in a house in Darien where her own older sister was, by every account I've ever heard from relatives who will still talk about it, the golden child of that generation. Valedictorian, a full ride to Wellesley, the kind of daughter who got toasted at every family gathering, while my mother sat one seat further from the head of the table. I don't think my mother ever fully worked out what to do with that old, unhealed hierarchy, except to recreate a version of it in her own house. Except this time, she got to choose who sat closer to the light. That doesn't make what she did to me acceptable. It doesn't make what she let happen to Camille, because I do believe, now, that she did something to Camille, too. Something just as damaging in the opposite direction. Raising a daughter to believe she was entitled to other people's work simply by virtue of being loved more loudly. Anything other than a failure of her own making. But it helped me stop looking for a villain with no interior life, and start understanding her as a person who broke 2 daughters in 2 different directions using the same set of tools. I don't forgive her for it. I do, now, understand it a little better than I did the week of the hearing. And I've decided that understanding is worth having even when forgiveness isn't available yet. The week after the hearing was, in some ways, harder than the hearing itself, because at least the hearing had given me something to do with my hands and my attention. The waiting afterward gave me nothing but time to sit with everything that had just happened. I went back to work at Elm City that Monday because Corinne insisted routine would help more than staying home would. And she was right. Mostly. Though I caught myself more than once standing in the middle of an intake interview with a completely different family, translating on autopilot while some part of my brain replayed a 12-second silence in a Harvard conference room. Priya came over most evenings that week, sometimes bringing dinner, sometimes just showing up with a bottle of wine and a willingness to sit on my couch while I stared at nothing in particular. On the Thursday before the decision came through, she finally said, gently, "You know you did everything right, regardless of what that committee decides, right? You're not waiting to find out if you told the truth. You already know that part. You're just waiting to find out if the institution is going to act on it." I told her I knew that, logically, and that knowing it logically and feeling it at 11 at night with my phone face up on the coffee table were 2 very different experiences. She didn't argue with that. She just refilled my glass and put on some show neither of us actually watched, because sometimes the kindest thing a friend can do is simply exist in the same room as you're waiting. On April 15th, I received an email from Harvard Law School admissions. Dear Ms. Calloway, on behalf of the Admissions Committee of Harvard Law School, it is my privilege to offer you a place in the entering class matriculating this August. Your file, your personal statement, and your interview reflected a candidate of extraordinary clinical judgment and integrity. We hope you will accept. Julian Voss, J.D., Dean of Admissions. I read it twice. I didn't cry. I texted Rosa one word. Yes. She wrote back, Valentina lo sabía. Valentina knew. I accepted the offer the next morning. I told no one in my family for 4 days. On April 22nd, the Harvard Law Committee on Academic Integrity and Professional Conduct delivered its decision. Camille Calloway was dismissed from Harvard Law School effective immediately for academic misrepresentation in her admissions materials. The letter, which Dean Voss forwarded to me as a courtesy alongside his own brief note, cited clear and convincing evidence of authorship fraud and a willful 8-month failure to correct the record after enrollment, and specifically referenced the applicant's signed acknowledgement of client confidentiality obligations executed prior to the essay's submission, which the committee finds directly undermines any claim of innocent misunderstanding. I read that sentence 3 times. I didn't feel the triumph I might have expected to feel reading it. Mostly I felt tired and a little sad, in a complicated way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. Sad for the sister who might have become someone very different if anyone in that house had ever once told her the truth was worth more than the story. I didn't cry over it, but I sat with the email open on my screen for a long time before I closed the laptop. My father called me that afternoon. He talked for almost 20 minutes. He didn't once ask me to reach out to Camille. He told me he was separating from my mother, that he'd already signed a lease on an apartment in Stamford, already paid the deposit, that he was moving out on the 25th. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I'm asking for time to do the rest of this the right way. I'd like to see you, whenever you're ready." I told him I would see him. I didn't tell him when. He moved out on schedule. I found out later from a cousin who still talks to my mother that the Greenwich rumor mill had a field day with it. 31 years of marriage ending 3 weeks after a scandal at Harvard Law nobody in that social circle would say out loud at the garden club, though apparently everyone managed to imply it fluently enough over cocktails. My Aunt Louise, my mother's younger sister, and the one relative who'd always treated me like an actual person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story, called me directly that same week. "I heard 3 different versions of what happened before anyone bothered calling you," she said. "One where Camille had a nervous breakdown, one where you sued the school out of jealousy, one, God help us, where it was somehow about a boy. I want to hear it from you, the real version, and then I'm going to correct every single person at that garden club myself." I told her the whole thing, start to finish, and she was quiet for a long moment at the end before she said, "Your mother did this to both of you, you know, just in opposite directions. I've watched it happen for 26 years and never said anything, because it wasn't my house to say it in. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I told her it wasn't her fault. She said she knew that, and that she was going to say something anyway because silence had apparently never once fixed anything in that family, and she was tired of testing the theory. My mother, according to the same cousin, told her Thursday lunch table that Camille had decided, entirely on her own, to take a gap year to explore other interests. I found a strange, quiet satisfaction in that particular lie, not because I wanted Camille hurt, but because it confirmed something I already suspected, that even now, even after everything, my mother's instinct wasn't to sit with what had happened. It was to manage the story around it. The same reflex that had put a 9-year-old's drawing under a stack of scarves in the first place. Camille didn't call me again after that April 7th conversation, and I didn't reach out to her either, not for a long while. I heard, secondhand, that she'd taken a paralegal job at a small firm in Hartford that fall. The kind of job that doesn't ask where you went to school before this, only whether you can show up on time and do the work in front of you. Part of me hopes that turns out to be the better path for her, genuinely. The one that lets her figure out who she is when nobody's handed her a script for it. part of me is still angry enough that I'm not ready to find out. Both of those things are true at once. And I've stopped trying to resolve them into something tidier than that. On April 23rd, at 9:14 in the evening, my mother sent me a single text. You destroyed your sister. I hope Harvard is worth it. I took a screenshot of it. I didn't reply. I didn't block her number. I left it sitting there in the thread, unanswered. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped holding it up for her. I called Rosa the evening the dismissal letter came through, before I'd even told my father I'd seen it. She was quiet for a moment when I finished explaining, and then she said, Maggie, I want you to hear me say something, and I want you to actually believe it instead of just being polite about it. I am not celebrating that your sister lost something. I am only glad that the truth finally got to stand where it belonged. Those are not the same feeling, even though I know they can look the same from the outside. I told her I understood, because I did. It was the same distinction I'd been sitting with myself since I read Camille's dismissal letter 3 times over. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular, about her LPN program applications, about a leak in her kitchen faucet she still hadn't gotten around to fixing. Ordinary conversation that felt, after everything, like a genuine gift. Before we hung up, she said, "Come see me soon. Not for any of this, just to eat." I told her I would, and a couple of weeks later I did. On a Saturday in early May, I drove to Bridgeport, where Rosa had moved after Valentina died because the old apartment in New Haven had too many ghosts sitting in its hallway. Her new place had 2 bedrooms and a small wooden table by the kitchen window. She'd made pepillon for lunch. There was a candle burning on the table, and above it, a small framed pencil drawing hanging on the wall. A drawing she'd had framed herself with a $3 frame from a thrift shop. It was the sketch. We ate. We talked about Valentina, about Hector, about what Rosa wanted to do once she'd saved enough to leave her job at the hotel, she was thinking, she told me, about training to become a licensed practical nurse. We ate. We talked about Valentina, about Hector, about what Rosa wanted to do once she'd saved enough to leave her job at the hotel, she was thinking, she told me, about training to become a licensed practical nurse. At one point, she got up and came back holding Judge Peluche, the stuffed rabbit Valentina had held court with for the better part of a year in our old intake office. His fur worn thin in the specific spots a small hand had loved him hardest. "I want you to have him," she said, setting him gently on the table between us. "He should live somewhere with sunlight now, not in a box." I told her I couldn't take him, that he belonged with her. She shook her head, firm about it in the way she got firm about very few things. "He belongs with the person she picked to hold his gavel when she couldn't anymore. You know that's what she'd say." I took him home that day, and he sits now on the shelf beside the framed drawing, presiding, still, over whatever comes next. After lunch, she stood and brought a small sewing kit to the table, a spool of white embroidery thread, a small wooden hoop, and a needle. "Maggie," she said, "la chaqueta." I asked what we were doing. She only smiled. "Then," she said. She turned the blazer inside out, opened the lining near where a heart would sit once the jacket was buttoned, and fixed the fabric in the embroidery hoop. She threaded the needle with white thread, and we worked in silence for the better part of 40 minutes, me holding the fabric taut while she stitched, slow and careful, the afternoon light crossing the table at the same angle the whole time. When she finished, she cut the thread with a small pair of kitchen scissors. On the inside lining of my blazer, in clean white embroidery, was a single letter, V. She tied off the thread and turned the blazer right side out again, holding it up to the window. The bleach stain was still there. The orange-yellow ghost of that February evening still ran down the front of the navy wool. But now, on the inside, where only I would ever know it was there, was a letter that would never come out of that fabric again. Ahora Valentina está adentro, she said, donde nadie te la puede quitar otra vez. Now Valentina is inside, where no one can ever take her from you again. Rosa, I said, thank you. No, she said, gracias a ti por escucharla. Thank you for listening to her. She'd also sewn a tiny matching V into the corner of her own kitchen apron so that on different mornings, in different kitchens, in two different lives that had somehow ended up woven together, Valentina would still be with both of us. I drove home that evening through a sunset that ran orange along the Long Island Sound. The blazer sat folded in a garment bag on the passenger seat. The framed drawing rode in the back, wrapped in a soft cloth on the floor of the car. A few days after we moved my things in, I walked over to campus on my own, mostly just to get used to the walk before it became routine, and ran into Dean Voss coming out of Griswold Hall with a stack of folders under one arm. He recognized me immediately, which shouldn't have surprised me given everything, but still did. Miss Calloway, he said, settling in? I told him I was, mostly. He asked, a little more carefully than his usual procedural tone, how I was doing. And I told him the truth, that most days were good, that some days still weren't, and that I was trying to let both of those things be true without rushing past either one. He nodded, the way I imagine he'd nodded at 100 students over 22 years who'd walked into his office carrying more than an application. For what it's worth, he said, the letter's back in that drawer. I kept it. I thought you should know it's not going anywhere. I didn't know quite what to say to that, so I just thanked him, and he wished me well, and we went our separate ways across the quad, and I stood there for a minute afterward before I kept walking, thinking about how strange it was that the drawer that had once held 14 months of waiting now just held one settled, quiet piece of paper, exactly where it belonged. I moved to Cambridge 2 weeks ago. Priya drove up with me in a rented van packed with the entire contents of my New Haven studio, most of which fit into a space smaller than her own kitchen back in Brooklyn. And we spent most of the 6-hour round trip of unloading arguing cheerfully about whether my one good bookshelf should go in the bedroom or by the window. An argument that had absolutely nothing to do with anything that had happened over the past year, and everything to do with two people who were finally, for one afternoon, allowed to think about nothing heavier than furniture placement. When we'd carried the last box in, Priya collapsed onto the bare floor of my new living room and said, "Okay, I take back every joke I made about how little furniture you own, because that would have been so much worse with an actual couch." I laughed for the first time in what felt like days. She looked around the empty apartment, still full of boxes, and said, more seriously, "You know this is the first place you've ever lived that nobody in your family had any hand in choosing, decorating, or judging. Not even a little. How does that feel?" I hadn't thought about it in those exact terms before, but she was right. And saying it out loud in that empty room made something in my chest loosen slightly, the way a knot does when you finally find the right end of the string to pull. I unzipped the garment bag and hung the blazer on a hook I'd already screwed into the wall beside my front door, the first thing I'd installed in the entire apartment, before the curtains, before the bed frame was even assembled. Priya stood next to me looking at it, the faded orange-yellow stain still visible across the navy wool even now, more than a year later. A permanent record of one night in a kitchen in Greenwich. "You know," she said, "most people would have thrown that thing away the second they could afford a new blazer." I told her I knew. I told her I didn't want a version of this story where the ugliest night gets edited out of the closet. I wanted the whole thing hanging there, stain and all, right next to the framed drawing on the shelf above it, because both of them were true at the same time, the way most real things are, the cruelty and the love, sitting one shelf apart, refusing to cancel each other out. We ordered takeout that first night in the new apartment and sat on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet. And at some point, Priya raised her paper cup of cheap champagne we'd bought at the corner store and said, "To Valentina, and to you finally getting to be exactly the lawyer she already knew you were." I raised mine back. I didn't say anything for a second because I still don't always trust my voice on that particular subject. And then I said, "To the sun coming up again," which Priya didn't fully understand the reference to, and I told her the story about the parking garage window while the takeout got cold, because some stories are worth letting the food get cold for. I haven't spoken to my mother since that text on April 23rd. I don't know yet if I ever will or what it would even look like if I did. I've spoken to my father twice since he moved to Stanford. Short, careful conversations. The kind two people have when they're both relearning how to be in a room together, without 3 decades of old dynamics running the whole show. He asked me the second time whether I thought there was a version of this where the 4 of us ever sat at a table again. I told him I honestly didn't know, and that I wasn't in a hurry to find out. And he said that was fair, and we left it there, which felt, for the first time in my adult life, like an honest place to leave something with him. I haven't spoken to Camille either. I think about her more than I expected to, especially on the days orientation reading gets hard and I remember, unwillingly, that she sat in these same lecture halls for 2 semesters before any of this caught up with her. I don't wish her the worst. I've decided, somewhere in the past few months, that wishing someone the worst takes up space I'd rather spend on people who are actually still in my life, showing up for me the way Rosa showed up on a video call to a room full of strangers to defend a truth that had nothing left in it for her to gain. But I also haven't reached out, and I don't know when or if I will. Some doors you leave unlocked without walking back through them yet. That's where that one sits, for now. I think a lot these days about what it actually means to be someone's advocate in the fullest sense of that word, because it's the thing I've spent my whole adult life training myself to become, and the thing I'll spend the rest of it trying to get better at. It doesn't mean being the loudest person in the room. It doesn't mean being related to someone by blood, or having known them the longest, or loving them the hardest, though all 3 of those things matter more than people sometimes admit. It means showing up, reliably, for the truth of someone's story, even when telling that truth costs you something real. Rosa taught me that first, without ever using those words. Valentina taught me the rest of it, in a hospital room with a window that faced a parking garage, one sunrise at a time. My mother once told me it was just a jacket. She was wrong about that, the same way she was wrong about most things over the years. The story she'd spent a lifetime building about our family turned out, in the end, to be just that, a story. The one page a 9-year-old dictated to her mother on a hospital worksheet in pencil is the version that turned out to be true. I'll start law school in a few weeks, in a city my sister had to leave behind her. I'll start it with a drawing on my shelf and a letter sewn into the lining of a bleached blazer, both of them mine now, and both of them still, in every way that matters, Valentina's. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I think you probably already know why I needed to tell it start to finish instead of just the highlight reel. If any part of this sounded like your own house growing up, if you've ever been the daughter somebody quietly decided to make smaller so someone else could stand in the light, I hope you heard the part that matters most. The record can still be corrected, even years later, even after the people who could have corrected it sooner chose not to. Like this video if it meant something to you tonight. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens when I actually start orientation next month, because trust me, this family isn't quite finished writing itself into my law school career just yet. And tell me down in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever found your own version of Valentina's letter, the one piece of truth that finally made somebody listen. I'll read every single one of them.